On a bitterly cold afternoon in New York City, the streets buzzed with life. Cars honked, people rushed by, and conversations filled the air. But amidst all the noise, a quiet cry echoed. The cry came from an old man sitting alone on a bench in Central Park. His clothes were tattered, his hair matted, and his body frail. Passers-by cast brief glances but quickly turned away. No one wanted to look too long. No one wanted to feel guilty. At that moment, a black SUV pulled up near the park. Out stepped a tall boy, his coat neatly buttoned, his shoes polished. He walked calmly, purposefully, his eyes scanning the crowd until they settled on the old man. The boy stopped. "What's he doing?" a man whispered. "That's Barron Trump," someone murmured. All eyes turned to him. Nobody moved, stunned into silence. The boy, former President Trump's youngest son, walked straight to the old man and knelt in front of him. He spoke softly, his words too quiet for anyone to hear, and then did something that left everyone frozen in place. He removed his coat. A woman gasped, and suddenly the crowd fell silent. The old man, trembling and hunched over, stared at Barron as if he couldn't believe his eyes. "Take it," Barron said gently, holding out his expensive black coat. The old man blinked, his cracked lips quivering. What are you doing? You'll get cold." "You're cold," Barron replied simply. The crowd stood motionless. Someone raised a phone to record. Others began to whisper, "He's serious. That's Trump's kid." The old man shook his head, tears welling in his cloudy eyes. "No one's given me anything in years. I can't take this." Barron didn't move. "It's yours now. Please, take it." The old man slowly reached out, his hands trembling as they grasped the coat. He clutched it tightly to his chest, his body racked with silent sobs. Barron sat down beside him on the bench. The sight of his polished shoes touching the grimy ground shocked the onlookers. Nobody knew what to say. Phones captured every second, but for the first time in a long while, no one wanted to leave. Something powerful was happening, something they couldn't explain. "Why are you here?" the old man asked after a long pause, his voice dry and brittle, like dead leaves in the wind. Barron smiled faintly. "I saw you." The old man blinked. "No one sees me. I'm invisible, just a pile of rags on a bench." "You're not invisible to me," Barron said softly. The old man looked down, his shoulders shaking as tears streamed down his face. "You don't even know my name, kid. What's your name?" Barron asked gently. The man hesitated for a long time, as if he had forgotten, and then whispered, "Jacob. My name is Jacob." The crowd let out a collective gasp. A few wiped tears from their eyes. People who had ignored Jacob for years now looked at him as if seeing him for the first time. "You matter, Jacob," Barron said. Jacob laughed bitterly through his tears. "How can you say that? Look at me." Barron didn't flinch. "Everyone matters." The crowd fell silent once more. In that moment, Jacob, the forgotten man, became a person to everyone watching, and for the first time in years, someone called him by name, Jacob. Barron looked down at Jacob's trembling hands and noticed they were empty. "Are you hungry?" Jacob hesitated, embarrassed. "I haven't eaten since yesterday." Without another word, Barron stood up and walked across the park to a nearby deli. The crowd stirred. Some followed him, while others stayed, watching Jacob, who clutched the coat like a lifeline. "Who is that boy?" a man whispered. "That kid's got guts," another replied. Inside the deli, Barron bought soup, sandwiches, and bottled water. People stared at him, recognizing who he was, but he didn't stop to explain. He carried the food out in both hands, as though it was the most important thing in the world. When Barron returned to the bench, Jacob looked at him with wide eyes. "You didn't have to do that." Jacob said. Barron handed him the bag of food. Everyone deserves a meal. Jacob pulled out the soup, his hands still trembling. He looked up, tears streaming down his face. Why are you doing all of this? Barron sat back down. Because you're here. The words hung in the air, breaking the hearts of those watching, leaving the crowd silent. The crowd around the bench grew larger. Cameras arrived, but no one dared to interrupt. There was something sacred about the scene. Barron sat quietly beside Jacob as he slowly ate the warm soup. The boy wasn't distracted or impatient. He simply sat there, calm and steady, as though he belonged. The atmosphere around the bench was heavy with emotion, a kind of silence that pulled people in. Suddenly, a woman pushed her way through the crowd, her pale face streaked with tears. She hesitated for a moment, her hands trembling as she clutched a tissue. "I know him," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. Heads turned sharply in her direction. The air seemed to shift, a collective intake of breath. Jacob froze, his spoon hanging in midair, his wide eyes locked on her. You know me?" he asked, his voice cracking with uncertainty. The woman nodded, tears spilling freely down her cheeks. "Your name is Jacob Lawrence, isn't it?" Jacob's hands began to shake uncontrollably, and the spoon slipped from his grasp, clattering onto the ground. His voice wavered as he managed to ask, How do you know that?" Her voice broke as she replied, her words laden with emotion. "You were my father's best friend. I remember you from when I was just a little girl. You used to bring flowers to our house every Christmas. I'll never forget that." Jacob's face crumpled, and he buried it in his hands, his shoulders heaving. The crowd, already overwhelmed, collectively gasped. Some people in the crowd began to cry openly, their own emotions spilling out as they watched the scene unfold. Barron, still kneeling quietly by Jacob's side, turned to the woman. His voice, though calm, carried a weight of compassion and curiosity. "What happened to him?" The woman looked at Barron, her tears momentarily halting as she collected herself. Her voice, thick with sadness, trembled as she answered. "He disappeared after his wife passed away. One day, he just vanished. We thought he was gone forever. My father never stopped wondering what happened to him. He always hoped Jacob was still out there somewhere." Jacob's muffled voice emerged from behind his hands, barely audible through the sobs. "I thought I was gone too," he whispered. The woman stepped closer, her own tears falling again. "Jacob, we missed you. My father would have been so happy to see you again. He always said you were like a brother to him." Jacob slowly lifted his head, his face wet with tears and his eyes brimming with pain. I couldn't stay. After she died, I just couldn't bear it. It hurt too much." The crowd, drawn further into Jacob's story, stood frozen in reverent silence. Even the distant sounds of the park seemed to fade as they watched this deeply human moment unfold. Barron reached out and placed a steadying hand on Jacob's shoulder. His voice, steady and grounding, broke through the moment. "But you're here now, Jacob," he said softly. Jacob turned to Barron, his face etched with years of anguish and regret. "Why would you care, kid? I'm just a broken man no one even notices anymore." Barron's gaze didn't waver. His voice was steady, but it carried a quiet power. "Because broken things can be fixed." The woman nodded, her lips trembling. "He's right. Jacob, you're not gone. Not anymore." And for a moment, as the crowd stood bearing witness to this reunion, Jacob let himself believe that might be true. Jacob couldn't lift his head. The woman's words washed over him like a wave, drowning him in memories he had long tried to bury. Her face was familiar, so familiar, but time had blurred much of what he once held dear. "Do you remember us?" she asked softly. Jacob's voice trembled as he replied, "Your father, He was my best friend. I brought flowers because I wanted your family to feel happy, even when life felt empty." The woman clutched her chest, tears falling freely. "You disappeared. Jacob, we thought something terrible had happened to you. My father never stopped asking about you." Jacob wiped his face, ashamed. "Life happened. My wife. I couldn't save her. After that, I gave up on myself. I didn't want to burden anyone, so I walked away." Barron looked at Jacob, his gaze steady and full of compassion. "But you're here now," Barron said gently. Jacob glanced at Barron, his eyes filled with anguish. "Why do you care, kid? I'm just a broken man on a bench." Barron's voice was calm and certain as he responded, "Because broken things can be fixed." The crowd listened, stunned, silent. Their hearts ached. And in that moment, Jacob dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, he hadn't been forgotten. The crowd around the bench grew larger, yet no one spoke. The air seemed heavy with emotion. Strangers, people who had never spoken to each other before, now held hands, shared tissues, and cried together. A little boy, holding his mother's hand, whispered softly, "Mom, why is everyone crying?" The woman replied, her voice breaking, "Because kindness is powerful, sweetheart." Suddenly, from within the crowd, a man began clapping. At first, it was just a soft, hesitant applause, but soon the sound grew louder, stronger. The applause spread through the park like a wave. Jacob looked up, confused. "What's happening?" he asked. "They're clapping for you," Barron replied. Jacob shook his head, tears streaming down his weathered face. "For me? No, I don't deserve that." "Yes, you do," Barron said firmly. "You're still here, and that's what matters." The applause echoed throughout the park, filling the air with a warmth that couldn't be ignored. But the crowd wasn't clapping for Barron, even though his actions had sparked it all. They were clapping for Jacob, for his story, for the hardships he had endured, and for the strength it took to keep going. For the first time in years, Jacob smiled through his tears. As the applause softened, a young woman stepped out from the crowd. She carried a thick red blanket in her arms, her eyes red from crying, but her head held high. She walked straight to Jacob and knelt before him. "This is for you," she said softly. Jacob stared at her, his voice trembling. Why are you doing this?" The young woman smiled through her tears. "Because kindness is contagious. That boy reminded me of that." Jacob's hands shook as he reached out to take the blanket. It was soft and warm. More than just a piece of fabric, it felt like love, dignity, and hope. Barron stood quietly, watching. His face remained calm, but his eyes glowed with pride. More people began to step forward, each carrying something in their hands. A man quietly placed a full bag of groceries beside the bench. Another walked up and handed Jacob a soft scarf and a pair of warm gloves. Jacob looked down at the growing pile of kindness surrounding him, his hands trembling. His voice broke as he whispered, "I don't understand. Why are people helping me?" Barron, still seated beside him, turned his calm, steady gaze toward Jacob. "Because you deserve it," he replied gently. Jacob looked from Barron to the crowd. The faces staring back at him were filled with compassion, their eyes soft with emotion. His lips quivered as he softly said, "I thought the world had forgotten me." A voice rose from somewhere in the crowd, clear and filled with conviction. "Not anymore. Jacob, not anymore." The words hung in the air, sending a ripple of emotion through the crowd. People nodded, some wiping away tears, others stepping forward with more gifts, small tokens of kindness, yet profoundly meaningful. Jacob sat frozen, struggling to process what was happening. Around him were strangers, people who didn't know his name a day ago, now surrounding him with warmth and generosity. They offered food, clothing, and something far more valuable, compassion. None of these people knew Jacob's story firsthand, but Barron's simple act had made them see him, truly see him. And in doing so, it had changed everything. Jacob was no longer invisible. Meanwhile, Barron sat quietly, observing this scene. He wasn't focused on the cameras that had gathered or the murmurs of admiration spreading through the crowd. He only cared about one thing: making sure Jacob was okay. "That boy is inspiring," someone in the crowd whispered, their voice thick with emotion. Another replied, "We need more people like him." Suddenly, a woman in the crowd stepped forward, clutching her phone tightly. Her cheeks were streaked with tears, but her eyes held a peculiar light, hope mixed with determination. "Jacob," she called softly. He looked up, startled by the unexpected sound of his name. "Yes?" The woman approached him slowly, her voice trembling. "There's someone who wants to talk to you," she said, holding out the phone. Jacob hesitated, his eyes wide with confusion and disbelief. "Who would want to talk to me?" he murmured. She didn't answer, just placed the phone gently in his hands. His fingers shook as he brought it to his ear. "Hello," he said weakly, his voice barely audible. On the other end of the line, a deep, familiar voice answered, rich with emotion. "Jacob, it's me." Jacob froze, his breath catching in his throat. Who is this?" he managed to ask, though his heart already knew the answer. "It's Henry," the voice replied, thick with warmth and disbelief. "Your best friend. I've been looking for you for years." Jacob's body seemed to collapse under the weight of the moment. Tears streamed freely down his face as he clutched the phone with both hands. "Henry, I can't believe it. Is it really you?" The voice on the other end trembled as Henry replied, "I saw the video of you. Jacob, I couldn't believe my eyes. You're alive. Jacob, you're alive." Jacob's sobs grew louder, his voice cracking as he tried to respond. I thought I was forgotten. I thought no one cared." Henry's voice steadied, though it was clear he, too, was overwhelmed with emotion. "You were never forgotten. Jacob, never. Come home. We've always loved you." Jacob bowed his head, pressing the phone to his ear as though it were a lifeline. His tears flowed freely, but for the first time in years, they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of hope. The crowd around the bench stood in stunned silence, watching the raw humanity of the moment. Strangers reached for each other's hands, their own tears falling as they bore witness to Jacob's reconnection with his past and with a future he thought he had lost. For Jacob, the world had finally shifted. He wasn't alone anymore. He wasn't invisible. And as he clung to the sound of Henry's voice, he felt something he hadn't dared to feel in years, the promise of being found again. Barron sat quietly in his room, the glow of his phone screen illuminating his face. He scrolled through countless posts and videos that had overtaken social media. The story of him and Jacob had gone viral, capturing hearts across the globe. Every platform was buzzing with comments. "This story brought me to tears. Kindness like this reminds me there's still good in the world. Thank you, Barron. I want to be a better person after seeing this." Each comment felt like a ripple from the single stone he had cast. And while Barron wasn't one to seek attention, he couldn't ignore the impact his actions had made. As he set his phone down, his mother knocked softly on the door before stepping in. Her expression was warm, filled with a mix of pride and curiosity. "Barron," she began, her voice gentle, "do you have any idea what you've done today?" Barron looked up, surprised by the question. "I just did what felt right," he said, shrugging slightly. She crossed the room, sitting beside him on the edge of the bed. Her hand rested lightly on his shoulder, a reassuring touch. "Sometimes," she said, her voice steady. Doing what feels right is the most powerful thing we can do. And what you did today, Barron, was extraordinary. He gave her a faint but meaningful smile. I think Jacob's going to be okay, he said after a moment. His mother nodded, her eyes soft with pride. And because of you, so many people are starting to remember that kindness matters. You've reminded them that even the smallest act of care can mean the world to someone. Barron's gaze drifted to the window, his mind replaying the events of the day. You know, he said softly, I didn't think people would even notice. I just couldn't leave him there. Not when I could do something about it. That's what makes it so special, she replied. You weren't looking for attention. You were just looking out for someone who needed help. And that's why it resonated with so many people. Barron turned back to her, his smile widening slightly. It's weird, though, seeing everyone react like this, like one small thing could make such a big difference. His mother chuckled softly. Sometimes, Barron, it's the smallest things that make the biggest waves. He nodded, letting her words sink in. The weight of the day lingered, but it wasn't heavy. It felt purposeful. I hope Jacob feels that, too, he said. Oh, I think he does, his mother assured him. And so do the millions of people who saw what you did today. Barron leaned back against his bed frame, his heart full but calm. He wasn't thinking about the videos, the comments, or the attention. He was thinking about Jacob, sitting on that bench, wrapped in a red blanket, his eyes filled with the hope he hadn't felt in years. And for Barron, that was all that mattered. The next morning, Jacob woke up. The red blanket was still wrapped around him, and for the first time in years, he felt something different, warmth. As he sat on his familiar bench, passers-by began to stop. Some brought hot coffee, others a bag of food, and some offered nothing more than a simple smile. A little girl smiled at him and said, "You matter." That's what the boy said. Jacob looked around, his heart overflowing with emotions he couldn't put into words. Meanwhile, Barron sat in his room, scrolling through countless comments. After watching this story, I brought food to a homeless shelter. I just hugged my dad for the first time in years. Thank you, Barron. Barron smiled quietly. He hadn't just helped Jacob. He had ignited a spark of compassion in the hearts of millions. That afternoon, as Jacob sat on the bench, a familiar black SUV pulled up to the curb. The crowd around him began to stir. The car door opened, and Barron stepped out, holding a small envelope in his hand. The crowd fell silent, all eyes on him as he walked purposefully toward Jacob. Jacob looked at him, his eyes wide with surprise. "Kid, what are you doing back here?" Barron smiled. "I'm not finished yet." He handed the envelope to Jacob. "What's this?" Jacob asked, his voice trembling. "Open it." Barron replied gently. Jacob carefully opened the envelope. His hands shook as he pulled out a handwritten note and a card. He read the note aloud. "Dear Jacob, you've inspired me. I want to help you start over. I've arranged a place for you to stay and recover. You don't have to do this alone. Your friend, Barron." Jacob looked up at Barron, tears streaming down his face. "Why me?" he whispered. "I'm just someone nobody notices." Barron knelt down, his gaze steady and unwavering. "To me, you're someone special. Everyone deserves a second chance." The crowd began to sob openly at the profoundly moving scene. The next morning, Jacob stood in front of a modest but welcoming apartment building. His breath caught as he stared at the door in front of him, unable to reconcile the reality with what his life had been just days ago. A social worker beside him smiled warmly, holding out a set of keys. "This is yours, Jacob. A fresh start," she said, her voice soft and encouraging. Jacob reached out with trembling hands, taking the keys as though they might vanish if he wasn't careful. He stared at them, feeling their weight. both physical and symbolic. For the first time in years, he wouldn't have to sleep on a cold park bench. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The apartment was simple: a small kitchen, a clean bathroom, and a single bed covered with a soft blanket. On the kitchen counter, there was a small bundle of basic groceries: bread, milk, canned soup. Next to them, a handwritten note read, "Welcome home, Jacob." Jacob sat on the edge of the bed, running his hands over the blanket. Its softness was almost overwhelming. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, the weight of his struggles seemed to ease, even just a little. He whispered to himself, "I don't deserve this." But then Barron's words echoed in his mind, "Broken things can be fixed." Jacob clenched the blanket in his hands and took a deep, steadying breath. In that moment, he made a quiet vow. "I will make this count," he said softly, the words carrying both determination and hope. In the weeks that followed, Jacob's life began to shift. With the help of the social workers and volunteers who had rallied around him, he found small jobs to keep himself busy. He started delivering packages for a local shop, his first step toward independence. Each paycheck, no matter how modest, felt like a victory. The transformation didn't stop there. Jacob began smiling more often, and to his own surprise, he found himself striking up conversations with his neighbors. They greeted him warmly, asked how he was doing, and even invited him for coffee. It was a far cry from the loneliness of the park bench. One crisp morning, as Jacob was brewing his first cup of coffee in his new home, a knock echoed from the door. He froze, unsure who it could be. Visitors were still a novelty. Setting down his mug, he walked to the door and opened it cautiously. Standing there was an older man, his hands shaking slightly, his eyes glassy with emotion. The man took a step forward, his voice soft but filled with longing. "Jacob." Jacob's breath caught in his throat. His knees threatened to buckle as he whispered, "Henry." Tears welled up in both their eyes. Without another word, they fell into each other's arms, holding on tightly like two people who had been lost at sea, finally finding safe harbor. "I thought you were gone forever," Henry said, his voice breaking with emotion. "I thought so too," Jacob replied, his own voice trembling. The tears fell freely now, but neither man let go. Henry pulled back just enough to look Jacob in the eyes, a smile breaking through his tears. "I've been searching for you for so long. I thought I'd never see you again." Jacob shook his head, overwhelmed. "I didn't think anyone was looking. I thought no one cared." Henry placed a firm hand on Jacob's shoulder. "You've always been cared for, Jacob. You just didn't know it." Meanwhile, across town, Barron continued his life as if nothing had changed. He went to school, hung out with his friends, and kept out of the spotlight. But what Barron didn't realize was just how far his small act of kindness had spread. One evening, as he sat in the living room with his mother, they turned on the TV. The screen flickered to life, showing a packed community center. On stage stood Jacob, looking more confident and alive than he had in years. His hair was neatly combed, his posture steady, and his voice filled with emotion. Jacob took a deep breath and began to speak. "Not long ago, I thought I was invisible. I thought my story was over." He paused, his eyes scanning the room, meeting the gaze of those who had come to hear him. But then a boy, Barron Trump, saw me. He reminded me that we all matter, no matter how broken we feel. The camera panned across the audience, showing tearful faces. Some people dabbed their eyes with tissues, while others held hands tightly, moved by Jacob's words. Jacob continued, his voice steady but filled with feeling. "Today, I stand here not because someone gave me charity, but because someone gave me hope. And now, I want to pass that hope on to others." The room erupted into applause. the kind that seemed to swell and echo with gratitude and belief in the power of kindness. Back at home, Barron sat on the couch, watching silently. His mother glanced at him, her expression filled with pride. Barron didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He simply smiled, soft and quiet, knowing that he had done something that mattered. This story isn't just about a boy helping a man in need. It's about the ripple effect of kindness and the profound impact one small act can have on the world. Barron didn't see Jacob as just another forgotten person on a park bench. He saw a human being who deserved dignity, compassion, and a chance to rebuild. Through his simple act of kindness, Barron reminded us all of a universal truth: no one is truly invisible. Jacob's transformation from hopelessness to a life filled with meaning is a testament to the power of hope. It shows that even in our darkest moments, the smallest gesture, a warm coat, a meal, a kind word, can reignite a spark within us. Barron didn't just give Jacob material things. He gave him something far more valuable: the belief that he mattered. But this story also challenges us. It asks, what can we do in our own lives to make someone feel seen? How often do we pass by someone in need, too busy or too uncomfortable to stop and acknowledge their humanity? We may not all have the means to change someone's life as dramatically as Barron did, but we all have the ability to show kindness. A smile, a helping hand, or even just listening to someone can make all the difference. This story reminds us that kindness is contagious. When we act with compassion, it inspires others to do the same. It creates a ripple effect, spreading far beyond what we can see. So let this story inspire you. Be the reason someone believes in kindness again. And remember, even the smallest acts can create the biggest changes. Together, we can make the world a little brighter.